Welcome to the glassworking shop. I'm trying something fairly ambitious today. I've got 4 cameras set up, and I'm going to be making a multi-layer bullseye marine that will be a component in a more complex assembly that will be mounted into a metal and wood base and result in one of my sculptures. So let's get going. On my new glassworking bench, I'm trying to keep things really clean and organized. When I first started doing glasswork, I fell into the trap of just letting stuff pile up, letting trash pile up, letting tools pile up, letting partially completed pieces pile up, and then eventually I ended up looking at the bench and going, where is everything? How come I can't find anything? So now I'm trying to adopt the discipline. Only the tools and materials needed for the operation in progress are going to be on the bench. So let's get started here. Another thing that I do, I've got this metal custom-made tool holder, and all of the tools are on shelves, easily within arm's reach. And the shelves are made of stainless steel so that I can put hot tools on them and not have to worry about it. Get the fan on. I intentionally chose a large diameter slow speed fan because I want to keep the noise down. Not only is it good to keep the noise down just for my own sanity while working, but it also helps with the audio for the video. So I'm going to be starting this bullseye using a stack of color rods heated and squeezed together on the squeezer, and then going to follow that with some striping using a hand torch and the NQALHA. I'm cutting the core rods to a little bit under 3 inches, which is a convenient length to work with. Also comes nicely out of a color rod. And the way this process works, I'm going to be using some of this stainless steel safety wire, which is commonly used in aviation and racing to keep bolts from loosening when they're being vibrated. I get the color rods kind of like roughly centered up with the center core in the middle and then the 6 rods around it in a hexagon shape. Wrap it twice with the safety wire. Then I've got these safety wire pliers, which are purpose-built for this application. You put the pliers on the wire, clamp it with the little clamp here, and then pull the back handle, and it's got a kind of like a screw thing in the back that twists the wire really nicely, makes a nice tight twist, and holds the rods together in a nice hexagon form. I use an assembly fixture here to hold the rods in place. Okay, now going to prepare the squeezer. I'm using the iris style dies for this application. The iris dies have a great benefit that one size fits all. Anything that can fit within the limits of motion will be squeezed. For this application, that's perfectly fine. The iris dies do produce a bit of sliding distortion, sliding against the glass as they move. For this application, which is just a solid color with a solid core, the distortion doesn't matter. In fact, in some cases, even when I'm doing complex stuff, the distortion is kind of cool. It's kind of cool to see the way the glass flows around. Sometimes it's unexpected, sometimes it's even fun. Sometimes it's even a good thing. So, turn on the gas here. When I really need precise control of squeezing, where the squeezing dies move perfectly perpendicular to the shape, then I have to use the fixed dies. And the problem with the fixed dies is you have to use the exact size. If you're making a pattern with 1 inch on a side, you have to use 1 inch dies. So I'm going to start off here doing some preparation. Get the torch going. I'm using a Delta Mag. I really like the Delta Mag. It gives a lot of flexibility for big fire when I need big fire, little fire when I don't. So what I'm doing now, just kind of roughly preparing a couple of punties. These are not really anything elaborate, just putting a little bit of an angle in the end, little bit of a roundness. And for my larger pieces, I use a way more complex Puntian moil. I really like using a big moil. Makes it easier to pull a marine pattern down without wasting too much in the knuckle. So I'm going to be using a hand torch here and preheating the end of the rod stack. For this very simple small rod stack, I leave the rods at room temperature, heat the end a little with the hand torch, and get to work. For the more complicated rod stacks, especially when I have stuff that I've spent a bunch of time making that I really care about, and I'm stacking it together, I preheat the rod stack in the kiln, and all of my assembly fixtures are made of steel, so they can easily tolerate kiln temperature. But for this simple little thing, okay to just stick it on. So first thing I do after sticking, just kind of roughly verify that it's on center. Make sure that the weld is good. And then I'm going to stick it in the NQALHA and start gently heating the end. Turn off the torch here. Carefully put my hand over the assembly fixture. Even though I know it's not hot, it's always a good idea just to feel for some radiant heat. Just make sure I'm safe before I touch it. So what I'm doing now, gently in the far flame, gently heating the ends of the rods, being very careful not to boil my color or overheat the rods. I'm just trying to get the ends to fuse together a little bit. Right now, the stack is only held together by the safety wire and the rear weld, and the rear weld is not the world's greatest, most solid weld, so the sooner I can get this thing safely fused together, the better. Okay, that looks like got that fused together, so now I'm gonna cut off the safety wire. Wire's probably hot, so it goes in the water bucket. And then just give it some fire, heat it up. One of the nice things about the NQALHA is that I can take my time, I can do things slowly. When I first started doing handwork, there was always the temptation to get impatient and rush and get the things too hot too fast. Ended up blistering, boiling, having all kinds of problems. With the NQALHA, it's much easier to just let the piece linger in the far flame, let it heat up slowly. What I'm trying to do in this rod stack, I'm trying to build core heat without overheating the outside layers, trying to build core heat and get everything fused together and drive out the air. I really don't have a big problem with trapped air using this technique. Seems to work pretty well. Now, let it go for a little while longer. I start with the preheating on the NQALHA and then switch to handwork as the piece starts getting floppy. I'm still trying to figure out when to use the NQALHA, when to use handwork. Okay, so it's about ready for the first squeeze. Take it over to the squeezer, and the first squeeze is just to kind of tag it together. Before it's tagged together, if you get the rods too hot, they can start bowing out. So, little bit by little bit. One of the nice things about the squeezer is that when the glass surface hits the graphite dies, the surface cools and the core heat remains. And this way I can continue building core heat without overheating the outer layers. Another thing that I do that probably you can't see in the video very easily is when I first put the piece in the squeezer, I don't use full squeezing force. I just let the glass barely touch and then give it the force. This kind of freezes the surface and minimizes some of the sliding distortion that the iris style dyes produce. So that's pretty much a nice little hexagon shape. Of course, I don't want a hexagon shape, I want a round shape, but the squeezer with the hex dyes gives a nice place to start. And then after everything is consolidated, compacted together, and the air is out of it, now I go back doing handwork and round it out a little bit. I suppose I could do this on the NQALHA, but it's real easy to do by hand. As I'm learning to use my machine, I'm constantly experimenting with, okay, what's a good thing to do by hand? What's a good thing to do on the NQALHA? And sometimes I just go back and forth. Sometimes I do it by hand, sometimes I do it on the NQALHA. Just kind of see what feels more natural to me. So there, and of course this inner core doesn't need to be perfectly round. It'll continue getting rounded up as the process continues. And a little bit of the hexagon shape is not a bad thing. So let me make sure this guy's on center. I switched to positioning mode here, and I'm going to be doing the striping on the NQALHA with a hand torch. I'm using the Mirage hand torch. I really like the Mirage hand torch. It's got that hand-mounted selector control to select from the Mirage flame and the center fire. I find it really useful. So going to be using NQALHA positioning mode for doing the striping. I find it very, very natural to do this. This is a somewhat unconventional technique. I think most glass workers just use the bench torch. But for me, using the hand torch kind of feels more like welding. And since I'm a welder, it really feels more natural. The color that I'm applying is a somewhat tricky color. And I'm moving the torch around, forward and back, up and down, trying to avoid boiling this color. It's a fairly sensitive one. Going a little bit beyond where the rod stack was. That kind of helps to strengthen the moil, makes it a little easier to deal with when I'm pulling it. So I find this method of striping to be very natural and intuitive, and it almost feels like the traditional method with the bench torch is kind of backward. It's like trying to do a painting with the paintbrush held in a vise and moving the canvas. And I know that many glassworkers have thousands of hours of practice with the bench torch method, and they get fantastic results. And to them it feels really natural. But on the NQALHA, I really like this method. I'm shooting this with a didinium filter on my video camera. I also had to put the camera into manual exposure and manual focus. The autofocus just doesn't work for glass blowing very well at all. It was yesterday when I tried this for the first time, I was drifting out of focus, and no, I'm not going to let anybody see yesterday's videos because it failed. I hope manual focus works better. I'm also using 3 stops underexposed because even with the didinium filter, the glass at the point where it's getting hot is just too bright. So now I'm going to switch to the rod holder, being very careful to be aware of where my hand torch is pointed so I don't set stuff on fire. Whenever I let the glass get cold, I kind of go back, hold down the pedal, let it rotate, knock off some of these little nubbins. They're kind of acute angles, and if the glass is going to crack, it's going to crack down on the base with those little nubbins. So, get everything reheated now that I have my rod in my rod holder. And continue. I'm attempting to do a one-man, 4-camera shoot here, and it's like glassworking is really hard, and I'm thinking, how can I make it even harder? Oh, try to do a one-man, 4-camera shoot with close-ups of hot glass, keeping everything in frame. And then edit the thing after improvising a monologue and try to make it entertaining. Trying to keep the stripes more or less uniform, more or less in a straight line. And it looks like I'm going to have plenty of color out of this rod. And there we have it. Going back into rotation mode, turn off the hand torch. And the first thing I do when I put it back in the flame is to get the back end hot. because that's where the trouble is going to happen if it gets too cold and starts cracking. And just kind of gently get some fire on it. Once again, being very gentle out in the far flame, using a neutral flame, possibly a tiny bit oxidizing. And then as I start compacting and rounding out, start at the far right end, apply very gentle paddle pressure. Keep the paddle cool. I've got my water bucket here off to the right and below the bench surface. When I started, I had the water bucket up on the bench, and seems like this is a lot better place to put it. Using very, very light paddle pressure. When paddling on the NQALHA, the glass does have a tendency to twist. And on this pattern, I kind of don't care about twist because it's just a bullseye, but it's good to practice managing twist so that I'm ready when it's time to do a piece where twist is important. And of course, to manage twist, just reverse rotation. Also, notice that I'm not using a lock collar. For the amount of time that the piece of glass is in the NQALHA and the speed that I'm operating and the paddle pressure that I'm using, I don't worry about drift. It isn't a problem. And of course, as I'm reversing direction to deal with the twist, it also deals with the drift. And of course, as I get closer to the floppy end, it's a little bit trickier to control. Hold my paddle over here a little bit and try to keep some of the spill away from the punty. I don't need to round it up all the way to the end because the end is just going to be in the throwaway part of the knuckle. So, not necessary to go completely crazy. First time I ever stuck a hot paddle in water, it was shocking. I thought something was exploding. Okay, that is a fairly uniform, round. Another nice thing that the NQALHA does is if you have it in the right position, you can use your Elmarver. So now I'm switching back to position mode, grabbing my next color rod, and you know what? Just to be extra careful here, there's a chance that I might not have enough with one rod, so let me get another rod prepared. Okay, a little bit of droop. Probably put it in a little too hot, but hey, I'm not going to worry about that. Doesn't bother me at all. The surface temperature that I'm striping onto is kind of critical. I don't want to get the piece that I'm striping onto too hot. When I started doing this, when I started striping, I had my striping rod too cold. I was using too much pressure pushing it in, and I had my piece that I was striping onto was way too hot. And this ended up putting divots in my pattern, and I wasn't getting a nice clean bullseye. Obviously, the surface that you're striping onto has to be hot enough for the glass to stick, and you have to kind of keep your temperature under control to deal with cracking, but you don't want it to get too hot. Don't want it to get too cold. It's all about the balance. This color is behaving a little bit nicer, not causing me as much pain as the last one. Of course, whenever I work with a color that has the tendency to boil, I always ask myself, is this just because of my skill level, or does it boil for everybody? I suspect it's my skill level. Although I do know that some colors have air in them, and even expert glass workers end up popping the air bubbles, and when you watch them, it looks like the glass is boiling. Okay, I think that's time to go get the rod holder and go ahead clean up the base a little bit. Make sure things aren't getting too cold. Preheat the end of the rod that got too cold. And back to the striping. This is the fourth layer. The final piece is going to be a 5-layer, and then it's going to be pulled down a little bit, not a lot. This one is not going to be pulled down into a stringer or a 7mm size. This one's going to be pulled down to a little under an inch, and then it's going to be squeezed, added to an assembly, squeezed some more, cut, assembled, squeezed. It's the first step in a long process. And yes, I will not be able to finish this striping with one color rod. I think that's the end for that rod. And another rod preheated. Still working on perfecting my striping. Seems like every time I do it, it gets a little better. And I'm trying to maintain as well as I can constant thickness, trying to make sure that every stripe nicely connects to the one next to it and welds together without gaps. I'm just trying to keep the thing overall as uniform as I can. I don't care if I boil those final ends, because they're just going to be on the knuckle and end up in the trash. So that is just about the second layer. So now I return to rotation mode, return to the big fire, get my hand torch turned off. Some of those nubbins knocked down. I'm going to lock off the twist axis because I don't really need twist. And I took it out of the flame, waited until the high point was at the top, and then momentarily turned it off. Fell back right on center. Put this, these rod ends away. I do save my shorts. I've got ideas. I don't want to waste any color. I even organize my shorts. I even put them in bins where they're all the same colors, are all stored together. As I continue my adventure in glasswork, I'm finding that it's really important to stay organized, under control. Don't let things get out of control. Reverse direction to manage the twist a little bit. And just relax. Watch the show. The machine's doing the work. The NQALHA makes, at least for me, makes glasswork so much more relaxing, and just lets me concentrate on thinking about what I'm doing, paying attention, watching what's going on. And of course, while I'm making this video, I'm improvising the monologue, so it makes it even harder. Okay. Keep the end of the punty a little bit cool with the paddle as I get closer to the thing flopping around. One thing that I notice watching people who aren't experienced using the NQALHA is that they let pieces get too hot and too floppy, and it's amazing how fast a floppy piece will go out of control on the NQALHA. It'll just happen before you have time to react to it. So it's a good idea to be a little careful when getting close to flopping around. Good to catch it before it becomes a problem. Because on the NQALHA, it will become a problem usually before you can even react to it. Even if your finger is on the stop button, it'll be out of control before you can push it. And of course, here I'm talking about being out of control, not paying attention to my glass, and I got a little bit of a problem here, but I think I'm more or less back. Okay, going to switch into positioning mode here for the final color, final stripe. One of my teachers told me that I should be striping on alternate sides of the piece. Do a stripe, rotate 180, do another stripe, rotate 180. And, you know, the guy's a great glass worker, and I do respect his opinion, but I find it more comfortable for me just to do them one after another. Of course, there has to be a reason why a very experienced glassworker would suggest that. So well, maybe I should think about that a little more. Going back and forth, kind of preheating the rod, trying to keep it straight, trying to keep a nice uniform thickness. Still haven't mastered the trick of getting a perfect little twisty pull-off at the end. Sometimes they're better than others. That one was a little better. Also trying to keep the edge of the previous stripe hot, so I get a nice clean weld and don't trap any air bubbles. Okay, let's switch to the rod holder. Clean up some of those ends. Make sure the bottom doesn't get too cold and crack. more heat into the piece. And this is the last stripe in the bunch. Like I said, this particular component is not going to be pulled down to a small diameter. In fact, I might not even pull it. I might just marver it down. I don't know. Might pull it a little bit. But this is going to be the center core of a reasonably complex assembled piece. As I continue this wonderful adventure in glasswork, my pieces get more complex, technique gets refined. I just love glass. Probably the hardest thing I've ever attempted to do. Fortunately, I have really good teachers. And, of course, I give thanks to all of the expert glassworkers that I've never met who have done YouTube videos. I really respect any expert who shares their knowledge frequently. Yeah, probably ended up putting this one in the NQALHA a tiny bit too quickly. But, hey, doesn't bother me. I can deal with it. When I first started doing the hand torch striping technique, I didn't have the Mirage, and I was doing it with a smaller hand torch, and it works, but I really like the Mirage flame for striping. We are now on the last stripe. And there we go. Back to rotation mode, back to fire. Lock off the twist axis. Boy, that guy sure did get off center. Okay. Trying to keep the bench clean and organized. And just sit back or stand back, let the machine do the work. Now there goes that steam explosion when the hot paddle hits the water. Wrong pedal. Got my two torch pedals and the NQALHA pedal. Probably should have prepared this punty a little bit better. As I progress along this path of becoming a glassworker, I'm trying more and more to plan ahead, get everything pre-positioned in place, and we should have got this done a little ahead of time, but it gives me a chance to show how if you forget some operation, you forget to do something, you're looking for a part, you're looking for a rod, you're looking for something, you can leave the piece spinning in the NQALHA while you go look for a tool, go look for a color rod, get a proper puntee prepared. You don't have to put the piece in the kiln and deal with kiln dust and temperature change. Kind of let it cook and back. Okay. Since I'm not going to be pulling this one down very much at all, I don't need to make a really big moil for the pieces that I make that are going to be pulled down more extremely. I use a very large moil. I try to minimize the waste in the knuckle and get as much of the pattern as I possibly can. This guy is getting really close. And that one last go on the L-marver. Reverse direction, slow it down a little bit. Get this puller attached. As I continue to work on improving my technique, I'm getting better and better at synchronizing the right hand with the NQALHA. good enough for a puller. So I'm going to soak a little heat into it. It's already had a fairly good heat base before I attach the puller. Now, I typically do my pulls by hand, the NQALHA out of the way. I typically do my pulls by hand. I'm probably going to be experimenting with pulling on the NQALHA, but at the moment, I get a little more control doing it by hand. I'm not pulling this one very far at all. Almost nothing. Now, as I'm heating the piece, I'm focusing my heat on the ends because it's real easy to let the center get too hot and end up with a really thin center section with a couple of giant knuckles. So I'm focusing my heat on the ends, also taking out what little bit of residual twist is left over, and very gently and minimally pulling the thing out. I think it would be a fascinating idea to explore marine pulling on the NQALHA using gravity with the piece clamped in place vertically and just working with a hand torch and letting gravity do the work. It's another thing on my to-do list. Trying to go back and forth between the ends, because if I let one end get really cold, cold glass is not our friend. Of course, since this is the inner core of an assembly that's going to be fairly extremely squeezed and mashed around, doesn't have to be perfectly cylindrical, but it's always just good to practice. Even if I don't need it perfectly cylindrical, just good to practice my pulling. Haven't made a perfect one yet, but seems like everyone gets a little bit better. I don't really need to waste a whole lot of time on this end because a lot of it is just throwaway glass anyway. Since I extended the stripe beyond the original rod stack. Another benefit of doing pulling by hand, I can feel the glass and feel it getting soft. Probably the most difficult part of learning glasswork for me has been observing the heat, learning what the heat looks like, managing the heat, controlling the heat. I think that really is kind of like the key to the kingdom of glasswork. And I am now very close to my final size. My final target size is about 1 inch. I think I'm doing pretty good. A little more fire here. And of course, it's not necessary to make this last little end totally perfect, because the pattern really isn't that good at the end, and I'll probably end up throwing it away. But okay. Move back to the other end. What I'm aiming for here is to get about 3 inches of usable material in the center. And I think I have that. Yep. Things are looking good. One trick that am continuing to learn to do is get the big fat part hot without getting the thin part next to it too hot. So go back and just get this guy an overall uniform heat. whip out the diamond shears. And it's off to the kiln. And that concludes today's glasswork. Thank you for watching. I'll continue making these videos as the project progresses, and hopefully, if I don't make too many mistakes along the way, you'll end up being able to see the final result.